Hi, this is a video about the return of conservatism. And the United States, in many ways, swung to the right and became more conservative from the 1980s until now. So the key question is why and how did the US return to the right? The 1950s had been a pretty conservative period, and here we are in the 1980s, the return of conservatism. So let's just again familiarize ourselves with the terms. Here's our political spectrum. So on the left is obviously the left, and then you have the center or the moderates, and then on the right is the right. Okay. Democrats and liberals tend to be on the left. They tend to want larger government, more change, faster change. Republicans and conservatives tend to be on the right. They want less change, slower change. Conservatives want to conserve the past, keep things the way they are. In general, again, liberals, Democrats tend to want a larger government to make change, help low income people, protect the environment, that sort of thing. And the right tends to be more pro business and doesn't want the government to interfere or make mistakes. So, why did the country swing to the right? Well, first of all, what happened in Vietnam? And what effect did Vietnam have on US politics? How did the government look? The US government said victory was just around the corner, but you remember the Pentagon Papers showed that that was not the case, and the government knew it, and the politicians are basically lying. And here you see American death tolls here. Even after 3, 4 years into it, American death tolls were considerable. And again, the Pentagon Papers revealed that the government knew they were in big trouble. They knew victory was not just around the corner, but they told the public differently. So here's the front page of the newspaper. It says documents reveal a U.S. effort to delay the election. And the politicians were not completely open and honest with the people about how poorly the war was going. So the people lost trust and faith in the government. So they wanted a smaller government. And what effect did Watergate have? Here's the Watergate complex in downtown Washington, D.C. It's a bunch of offices, apartment buildings, that sort of thing right by the Potomac River. And Nixon had some of his thugs, basically some of his boys, break into the Democratic Party offices. And the security guards saw that the tape on the door was broken. And so from roughly 1973 to 74, we get the Watergate scandal. Nixon denies playing any role in the cover up. And that was not the case. Okay. So, again, there were tapes. He'd been taping his White House Oval Office conversations. And then there was found to be an 18.5 minute gap in the tapes. So it looked like Nixon was trying to hide something. And before he could be impeached by the House of Representatives and convicted and kicked out of office by the Senate, Nixon resigned. And his vice president, Gerald Ford, became president. Okay. So this scandal made the politician look how. And it made people lose faith and trust in the government. And so they wanted a smaller government. Another setback was in foreign policy. Under Jimmy Carter, he was a Democratic president from 1976 to 1980. In Iran, the revolution happened, and some Iranians took over the U.S. Embassy and took Americans hostage for over a year. Carter sent in helicopters to try to rescue them, and the helicopters crashed. Sand got in the engine, and the helicopters crashed. So it was another government failure, another politician who was seen to be weak and ineffective. Also, Carter failed to bring down inflation. Inflation is when prices go up and life becomes more expensive. Gas, milk, eggs, bread, it all becomes more expensive. So, did the workers like that? Did the workers like it when their paycheck didn't buy as much? And here you see inflation peaking there because of all the government spending on Vietnam, on the war on poverty, on Medicare, on Medicaid. And then we get the first oil shock, 73, 74, because the U.S. supported Israel. The Arab Muslims who dominated OPEC cut down on the oil supply. And there's a similar thing in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution. Less oil supply, prices go up, it drives inflation up. So here we have our quote unquote misery index. The misery index is made up of unemployment and inflation. And you see it really sparks here under Carter. Okay, so people were not happy. And that leads to Ronald Reagan becoming president. And Reagan comes in and he cuts taxes on the rich. He's a conservative Republican, and they believe that's the right thing to do. So here you see 80, 81, 82. He comes in 81, 82, and he cuts taxes on the rich. Okay, so people had more money in their pockets. What effect did that have on the US economy? The economy grew. So if you look here at the annual GDP growth rates, GDP stands for gross domestic product. It's sort of everything the country makes. What do you notice? Excuse me. If you go here to the late 70s, okay, you get this stagnation here, and the government was the economy was not growing. And then Reagan comes in and he cuts taxes, and the economy grows in the 1980s. So here's Carter's stagflation, not a lot of growth in the late 70s. Reagan cuts taxes and the economy grows. But the tax cuts and more military spending on the Cold War meant that debt went where? All right, so here we have the Reagan presidency and the Bush presidency in the 1990s. They're spending more in the military, but they cut income taxes, at least Reagan did. And so the debt went where? It went up. So, in addition to the Vietnam problems and Watergate and Carter's inability to rescue the hostages and conquer inflation, there were also social reasons. In addition to those political and economic reasons, there were social reasons why the US moved to the right. For example, there was court ordered busing, for example, the Boston busing crisis. Louisa Day Hicks and the Boston School Committee had resisted segregation for years, and Judge Arthur Garrity ordered busing. He said, we got to bus these kids from the white neighborhoods and the black neighborhoods to correct the racial imbalance in the schools. Did conservatives like having unelected judges such as Arthur Garrity determine where their kids would go to school? Did conservatives who want a small government, who don't want the government to boss them around, did conservatives like unelected judges determining where their kids would go to school? Here we see that not all Americans agreed. Here's a photo of some whites throwing rocks at blacks on the first day of busing in Dorchester. And so the police had to escort the buses of black students into Dorchester, South Boston, that kind of thing. There was a white backlash, white reaction against court ordered busing. Okay, so here you see a presentation, a demonstration, and they're protesting. And they said, whites have rights too. You're violating our rights. You're sending our kids to school across town. And this is a very, very famous photo of a white Bostonian trying to hit or stab a black lawyer, Landsmark, with a flagpole. So again, history is nothing but action and reaction, cause and effect. When the judge ordered the Boston busing, there were a couple reactions. Some people reacted with violence. Some people reacted with demonstrations. And another reaction was white flight, and some whites moved to the suburbs. Here you see, unfortunately, two white kids here hitting a black student between two parked cars. So not good. Another social issue of the 1980s, should flag burning be made a crime or should it be allowed? And not all Americans agreed. The left believes that it's okay to burn a flag. It's a free speech. You're expressing yourself and your views, so the left values free speech more. The right says if you live in America, this should mean something to you. It's an icon, it's a symbol of freedom, and you shouldn't burn the flag. It's disgraceful, says the conservatives on the right. What kind of rights does the Second Amendment give? Not all Americans agree. So the left wants gun control, as you see here in this sign, and the left basically wants gun control. So maybe a personal handgun for protection or for a gun for hunting, but a lot of rules and regulations. The right believes that militias have a right to carry guns and individuals have a right to carry guns, and they want few limits. The 1980s also featured an increase in religious conservatives. For example, Jerry Falwell was a TV preacher, and so was Pat Robertson. These people were on TV preaching. They had a lot of followers and a lot of influence and power. Should abortion be illegal? Should abortion be legal? Again, not all Americans agree. The left tends to believe it's the woman's body, it's her right, it's her choice. We call that position pro choice. The right tends to believe that abortion kills a human being, it's murder, and they tend to be pro life. They say we got to protect the unborn. So lots of cultural issues were divisive. Another one, should prayer be allowed in public schools? Not all Americans agree. The right believes, for example, here's Republican President George H.W. Bush. He says something's wrong when kids can get birth control in school, but you can't say a prayer in school. On the other hand, Jimmy Carter says our country was founded on the fact that no particular religious faith would have ascendance, separation of church and state. We should not have school prayer in a public school. Another controversial issue was affirmative action in schools and in hiring. In other words, should you take into account someone's race or background when looking to admit someone to a school or hire them in a company? Not all Americans agree. The left tends to be in favor of affirmative action for a bunch of reasons, saying things like it corrects past mistakes and problems and discrimination, and it makes our schools and companies more diverse. They'll work better. On the other hand, the right believes that we should abolish affirmative action. Here's a white man holding this sign. It says here, I'm a victim of a hate crime. He's basically calling affirmative action a violation of his rights. And the argument on the right is, you should admit someone into a school or company because of their grades or what they've done, their actions, not because of who they are, but because of what they've done. There were also a few intellectuals that helped the country move to the right. For example, Milton Friedman was a famous economics professor at the University of Chicago. He wrote a bunch of articles and books, and basically he said we should have low taxes, let people keep their money, no Vietnam War draft, let people have their time, low taxes, no draft, let people have money and time, and they will be truly free. He saw the government as wasteful. For example, if you put the federal government and politicians in charge of the Sahara Desert, in 5 years there'd be a shortage of sand. In other words, the government's going to waste stuff. So these people were on the right. Another influential conservative thinker was William Buckley. He wrote articles and he started a magazine. He said idealism is fine, but as it approaches reality, the costs become prohibitive. In other words, super, super expensive. So back in the 60s and 70s, you had liberal presidents like LBJ spending a lot on Medicare, spending a lot on Medicaid, spending a lot on the war on poverty. And people like William Buckley said these costs were getting out of control and taxes were too high. Also, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. So communism on the far left did not work, and capitalism on the right looked like that was the way to go. This is another reason why the country swung to the right. Also, the US population got older, grayer, more gray hairs, and old people tend to be more conservative or more liberal. So this is basically what we call an age pyramid. And you can see here, as we move from the 1900s in the dark red to the 1950s and then to 2000, we get more old people at the top of the pyramid. We also have more young people, but more old people here. People are living longer, more old people, and they tend to be more conservative. Another factor causing the country to swing to the right was that a lot of Americans moved from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. In other words, from the cold, industrial north, places like Chicago, Illinois, Detroit, Michigan, Cleveland, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Boston, and people moved to the south, places like LA, Las Vegas, Phoenix, Arizona, Dallas, Houston, Florida, Atlanta, Charlotte, North Carolina. It's warmer, it's cheaper, and as people moved south, they became more conservative. Also, there were more Latino immigrants, and a lot of them are Catholic and they're conservative, and that was another factor. So, what was the effect? What was the result of all of this? Well, for example, in the 1980 election, you had a conservative Republican in Reagan, and he really beat Carter badly. Okay, this is a landslide election. The conservative Republican Reagan beat the liberal Democratic Carter, and it's a landslide election. You can see how conservative the country was. 4 years later, Reagan again has a huge victory. He beats a Democratic candidate, Walter Mondale, who was a senator from Minnesota. That was the only state Mondale won. And in 1988, George H.W. Bush beat Dukakis. Michael Dukakis was the Democratic governor from Massachusetts. And again, the country, the voters were mostly Republican. Here are a few highlights from George H.W. Bush's career. First of all, he was very well prepared to be president. He went to Phillips. He was the president of the senior class. In World War II, he was a Navy pilot. Even though he was very young, he was in combat. He got shot down, but he lived. He got a medal. He married his wife, Barbara Bush, went to Yale, majored in economics, and graduated Phi Beta Kappa. So that means he was at the top of his class. Excellent schools, served in the military, worked in the family oil business in Texas, so he had exposure to the South, exposure to business, and his father was a U.S. Senator from Connecticut, so he also has ties to the Northeast. He then was a U.S. representative from Texas, and then he was the U.S. representative to the United Nations, so he had exposure to foreign policy. He led the Republican National Committee. They raised money for the Republicans, so he was used to fundraising. He was the head of the CIA. He was vice president under Reagan and then president. Very impressive background. What are the highlights of his presidency? He said, read my lips, no new taxes, but he did raise taxes on the rich. And in 1990, he and Congress passed the American with Disabilities Act. It outlawed discrimination in unemployment, public accommodations, and transportation. So, for example, schools now have to have ramps and elevators. McDonald's has to have a ramp so that people in a wheelchair can get in. And in 1990, he passed the Clean Air Act to reduce pollution. In foreign policy, there was more arms control. He signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty with the Soviet president, Mikhail Gorbachev. And so that reduced strategic arms. In other words, big reductions in the nuclear weapons. And then the next year, 1991, the Soviet Union dies. It's the end of the Cold War, and we get the Persian Gulf War. Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait to take the oil-rich land. The U.S. and allies quickly pushed Iraq's military out, so that was a quick victory. You can see the conservatism in the clothes and the fashion of the 1980s. What was cool. It was kind of a country club look, kind of a preppy look, lots of pink and green here, sort of country club. You see the women, they kind of had, sort of big hair. Some of these jackets had like padded shoulders to appear kind of more masculine. All right, this was kind of what was in. This was Princess Diana, the princess in England, and she was considered very fashionable. My older sister had this kind of a haircut growing up. It was very cool. That is different from the grunge look of the 1990s, which was more rebellious. So you can see here the kind of tie-dye kind of coming from the hippies in the 1960s. All right. And you see this kind of says peace protest here. Again, sort of bringing back the 1960s and the peace protests against the Vietnam War. So again, the 1980s fashion was more conservative. Let's now leave the 80s, and the pendulum is going to swing from the right to the left to Bill Clinton, a Democrat, but still, he was pretty moderate, pretty centrist. He's president from 93 to 2001. Bill Clinton's background, and here's his wife, Hillary Clinton, who became Secretary of State and Senator of New York. Bill Clinton was born and raised in Arkansas, went to Georgetown, went to Yale Law School, so good education. He was the Arkansas Attorney General and governor, and he's the first baby boomer to be president, so first one to be born after World War II. He was a centrist, moderate Democrat. So even the Democrats are becoming more conservative here. He was a moderate Democrat. For example, more liberal Democrats were against free trade with other countries because they feared losing jobs. But Clinton and Congress did the North American Free Trade Agreement called NAFTA. It lowered tariffs among the US, Canada, and Mexico, so there's more trade among those countries. More liberal Democrats spent a lot, but Bill Clinton cut military spending because you had the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union was not a threat. And he raised taxes on the rich, and so he balanced the budget. In other words, government spending basically equaled government income. And you can see that here in this graph. Almost every year for decades, the government had been spending more money than it brought in. In other words, the government had been running deficits because of all the spending on Vietnam and Medicare, Medicaid, and that sort of thing. And then the Republicans, Reagan, cut taxes. So the government had been falling into deficits and debt. But Clinton here raised taxes on the rich, cuts military spending, and so the government ran a surplus for a few years. Clinton said, "We've worked to give the American people a smaller government." He said, "The era of big government is over." So that gives you a sense of how conservative the country had become for a Democrat to say that. Another example, he and the Republican Congress changed welfare. So there were time limits to how long you could get government money, how long you could get a welfare check, and you had to look for a job in order to keep getting government money. Also, more liberal Democrats embraced same sex marriage, but Clinton and Republican Congress did the Defense of Marriage Act. It said marriage is between one man and one woman, and states do not have to recognize same sex marriages granted by other states. For example, Massachusetts was the first to allow same sex marriages in 2004, but this Defense of Marriage Act says that a more conservative state like Alabama or Mississippi does not have to recognize Massachusetts gay marriages. Clinton also started the don't ask, don't tell policy in the military. In other words, soldiers could be gay in the military, but the military should not ask them about it, and those soldiers shouldn't tell people about it. In other words, let's kind of keep this quiet. And a lot of historians say this sort of marks the end of the Lavender Scare. There was increasing acceptance of homosexuality, homosexual soldiers, but Clinton's basically saying, let's try to keep this quiet. Clinton also had some failures. The Monica Lewinsky scandal. He basically had sexual relations with a White House intern, and he cheated on his wife. And the House of Representatives impeached him. They accused him of perjury or lying under oath and obstructing justice, but the Senate acquitted him, so he was not kicked out of office. And he and Hillary wanted to get universal health care for everybody, and that did not happen. During his presidency in 1994, Newt Gingrich was important. Newt Gingrich was a Republican representative from Georgia, and he made up this contract with America. And this was kind of the Republican Party platform, and it helped the Republicans win control of the House of Representatives for the first time since 1952. The House became under Republican control. Here's a copy of the Contract with America as a book with all the promises the Republicans said they were going to do, Newt Gingrich. And he basically made up these cassette tapes, and he told the other Republicans who were running for office, listen to the cassettes, learn this message, and let's all speak with one voice. And the message basically was Democrats were bad. This is back when the Soviet Union still, the Democrats were bad, and we need lower taxes and less spending. Okay, so here you see Fiscal Responsibility Act. They wanted less spending, lower taxes, taking back our streets. They want to be tough on crime. Okay, personal responsibility, family reinforcement. This is pro-life. Okay, and that was very effective for the Republicans. Okay, now the pendulum's going to swing back to the right. George W. Bush, a conservative Republican, was president from 2001 to 2009. He's a conservative Republican, so he cut taxes on the rich. And the biggest event in his presidency was the 9/11 2001 terrorist attacks when Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda terrorists attacked the United States. 3,000 Americans died, and they had trained in Afghanistan. So the U.S. invaded Afghanistan and later Iraq. Bush spent more on the military while he cut taxes on the rich, and so the debt increased. He also did the No Child Left Behind Act, and that meant more federal money for schools and also more federal standards and expectations for schools. That's unusual because if you remember, it's the states and towns that really run the schools. Then the pendulum swings back to the left. You get Obama, a liberal Democrat. He's president from 2009 to 2017. He's a liberal Democrat, so he wants bigger government. For example, he did Obamacare, and it was a law that required people to get health insurance. The government raised taxes on the rich more and used that money to help low income people pay for health insurance. Everybody's going to sign up for health insurance, okay? And the government taxed the rich more, and they used that money to help low income people pay for health insurance. Obama also was very concerned about global warming and climate change, and so he had the United States join the Paris Climate Agreement against pollution. But not all Americans agree. So then the pendulum's going to swing back to the right, and Trump, a conservative Republican, is going to become president. He was a conservative Republican. He wanted smaller government. For example, he cut taxes for the rich and for companies. He appointed 3 conservative justices to the Supreme Court, and he was more laissez faire or hands off. For example, he relaxed pollution regulations. So, what we see here is some changes in party in US politics. US politics and voters changed. From 1931 to 1953, we had 22 years of Democratic presidents. That's FDR and Truman. Okay, so you can see it here. FDR wins in a landslide, Republican Hoover is tossed out, and the country is mostly blue for a long time. The country is mostly Democratic. And the Democratic support came from the white South, the African Americans, farmers, workers, immigrants, women, progressive intellectuals, calling for a more active government. They liked the New Deal jobs program because it helped America deal with the Great Depression. But then this Democratic coalition under Roosevelt starts to break down. So here it is again, these groups, okay, the white South, African Americans, farmers, factory workers, immigrants, women, progressives, liberals, and intellectuals, it starts to break up and change. For example, the white South, known as the Solid South, they had voted Democratic since Andrew Jackson, and they were solidly Democratic. They started to vote Republican. Why? Because of Nixon's Southern strategy. I'll explain that next slide. And they want low taxes. African Americans still voted mostly Democratic. They tend to want government programs. I'm generalizing here about big groups here. So, there are always problems with generalizations. Farmers, for the most part, again, not all of them, but for the most part, they started to vote Republican because of Nixon's Southern strategy. And I'll show you that next class. Factory workers, a lot of unions are still Democratic, but more workers started to vote Republican. So I sort of put that in purple as a combination of blue Democratic and red Republican. Some workers were unhappy. The factory jobs had gone abroad, maybe to Mexico, maybe to China, and workers hate inflation. They were mad that Carter couldn't bring down inflation, and they want taxes to be low. And there are also some of those cultural issues. There were some workers who opposed affirmative action, workers who opposed gun control. So some of them moved to the right. Immigrants, for the most part, still vote Democratic. But a lot of Latinos are Catholic, they're conservatives, some vote Republican. So again, I put that in purple as sort of a combo of Republican and Democratic. Women, progressives, and intellectuals still tend to vote Democratic. There are lots of reasons why, but for women, Democrats tend to be pro-choice, and a lot of these people believe in larger government to help the poor, or to protect the environment, or to regulate companies. So basically what happens here is you can see the Solid South in blue. It had been Democratic. Going back here, this is after the Civil War. Solid South is blue, Solid South is blue, Solid South is blue the whole time here. Okay, voting Democratic. But that changes partly with Nixon. Nixon had a Southern strategy, and it helped turn the Solid South from solidly Democratic to solidly Republican. What was the Southern strategy? Well, Nixon knew that Republicans could no longer speak of segregation and white rule without alienating or turning off moderate white voters. So instead, the Republican politicians began to use sort of coded phrases like law and order, suggesting intolerance of anti war and civil rights protests, saying kind of those protesters are breaking the law. And Nixon talked about his silent majority. He said, there's really a majority of people who support me. I know they're not out loud, they're not protesting, but there are a lot of white Southerners who kind of quietly support me. And the Republicans talked about states' rights. And so that indicated opposition to the federal government mandates or requirements about civil rights. And Nixon and the Republicans really tapped into and took advantage of racial and political anger. Okay. So Nixon enforced some federal desegregation laws, but he also let the courts slow down school desegregation. Okay. He let these places slow down the court ordered busing and really slow down the integration. And so the South is going to swing Republican. So again, going back to after the Civil War, solid South, blue, 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 blue. You can follow that. And then when we get up to more recent times, sorry, when we get up to more recent times, now you're going to see the South here, 1960, it's blue, JFK. Now you're going to start to see the South here go red. Okay. Here they're voting for the racist Wallace. Okay. And here it's red with Nixon. And here you're going to start to see the South go consistently red and Republican, 80, 84, 88. Okay, 2000, 2004, 2008. Okay, so there is a change there. More recently, Trump won the South. Okay, and that was one of the reasons why he beat Hillary Clinton. And Trump won most of the South. Biden did win Georgia, and that was one reason why Biden won. So, again, in general, the country swung to the right during this time period, and it's for a confluence of factors. I hope this is clear. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.